The logo for the exhibit, as I mentioned, it is a brand new exhibit. It just opened on August 8th, 2010. I thought before I also show you pictures of some of the exhibit, I'd show a few historical pictures of the collection in various disguises over the years. Here it is in the 1920s in the Arts and Industries building over on the National Mall, which is the building right next door to the Smithsonian Castle. This is the original stamp exhibit that was curated by the first curator of the collection, a man named Joseph Levy, in 1913. And the stamp collection, as we'll see in a later picture, was actually in these pull-out frames for over 50 years, although not always in this building. This is the Hall of Philately and Postal History, which some people might remember. This was on the third floor of the Museum of History and Technology, which is now the American History Museum. When it opened in 1964, the new philatelic galleries up there were called the Hall of Philately and Postal History. In 1973, they were redesigned and renamed the Hall of Stamps and the Mail. And the exhibit that's on display here is an exhibit of original art for the Mexico City 1968 Olympic stamps. This is also up in the Hall of Philately and Postal History. This is an all-Scandinavian exhibit curated in 1970. I like the centerpiece of the exhibit, which is this Viking longboat here in the middle of the Philatelic Gallery. The National Postal Museum, the building that you're in now, opened in 1993. This is the block of 4 stamps that was issued for the opening of our museum. And they were printed in sheets of, panes of 20, sold at the post office in panes of 20 stamps. 2 of these panes of 20 escaped imperforate. And you see this is a block of 4 from one of those imperforate panes. You'll actually see these out in the gallery. One of the reasons I am really excited about this exhibit is there's quite a large quantity of foreign material, really good foreign material to see in this exhibit. And it's really the first time we've shown quality foreign material in a gallery setting since the exhibition of the Royal Philatelic Collection, the Queen's Own, which was in about 2004, 2005. So it's been a good 5 years since we've had a really strong showing of foreign material in the rotating philatelic gallery. So I'm glad that we're able to do that. And all of these pieces you'll see out in the gallery. This is the museum's Lady MacLeod on cover, first stamp issued in Trinidad by a ship captain who was constantly being asked to take letters, and so he thought that to make this process easier and facilitate it, he printed his own stamps, so they're considered by collectors to be a local issue. But he printed them up in sheets, and that's actually a picture of the Lady MacLeod on the stamp and then the initials as well. There are only about 40 of these Lady MacLeod stamps on cover, and we're lucky enough to have one. This is from the Belgian Congo, or the Congo Free State, as it was called at the time. This is an invert error. You can see that the center of the stamp shows a river scene on the Stanley River, or near the on the Congo River at the Stanley Falls, and you can see those canoes are upside down. So we got upside down planes, trains, canoes, whatever you want, we have it upside down. This block of 4 stamps is from the collection of King Farouk, which you'll see a larger selection out in the gallery. But King Farouk was of Egypt, was a stamp collector, as was his father before him, King Fuad. And during the whole of the reign of King Fuad and King Farouk, when the Egyptian State Printing Office took over printing stamps about 1926, they would print a single sheet of imperforate stamps on special thick paper for the royal collection. No collectors really knew that this was being done. And when King Farouk was overthrown in the Egyptian Revolution, and the revolutionaries confiscated all of the royal collections and ordered them sold to fund the revolution, these imperforate stamps started showing up on the market. And very few collectors knew what they were, and there were all kinds of strange stories and rumors circulating about what they might be, until one collector, who you'll see out in the gallery, amassed a quantity of them and began writing them up and describing what they were, that they were actually out of the Farouk collection. So you'll see some of those out there. This is the penny black, the world's first postage stamp, issued in 1840, but this is an extremely scarce variety. The penny black itself is not a particularly rare stamp, but the scarce variety with V and R in the upper corners is on display out in the gallery. Stamps that were sold to the public had little stars in the upper corners, but the VR, the monogram of the Queen, Victoria Regina, Victoria the Queen, was a special printing that was meant for use on official mail, government mail, but it was never put into use. It was decided that special stamps weren't really needed for government mail. The government could just use the same stamps that everybody else used. So the stamps were never actually put into use. And so the VR official stamp, as it's known, is fairly scarce. You'll see one of those out in the gallery. This is an early Japan cover from the collection of A.M. Tracy Woodward, who was one of the great early students of Japanese stamps. Another thing that we're showing for the first time in this particular exhibit are some recent acquisitions, material that's come into the collection in this century, so since 2001. These are two pieces from the famous Jeffries collection, which was at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia for many, many years. It was acquired by the National Postal Museum in 2008. This is one of the unique set of signed die proofs for the Overrun Countries issue. This series of stamps was issued in the United States in 1943 and 44. It was a series of 13 stamps with the same frame, but then the center of each stamp was different, and each stamp showed the flag of a different country that had been overrun and occupied by fascist forces in Europe and also in Asia. The 5 cents Connell, which you'll see out in the gallery as well, is another one of those stamps that's scarce because it was never actually issued. When New Brunswick needed a new set of postage stamps, the Postmaster General of New Brunswick in Canada put himself on the 5 cent stamp, which caused a great deal of outrage. At the time, only members of the royal family could appear on stamps in Britain and the Commonwealth, and he ultimately lost his job over it. The entire issue of stamps was confiscated and destroyed, but a number of copies slipped out. They're thought to have been kept by Connell himself as a souvenir and distributed over the years. You'll see one of those out in the gallery. And then also this trophy is part of a larger group of memorabilia that you'll see out in the gallery. And this is from the estate of Catherine Manning, who was curator of the Philatelic Collection at the Smithsonian for 30 years, from 1921 until 1951. And so we're pleased to be able to show material relating to her philatelic career as well. Okay, so into the stories of the ones that got away. One thing that you will see out in the gallery is this sheet of stamps, or proofs actually of stamps. These are known as the Panama Pacific die proofs. In 1915, there was a World's Fair out in California called the Panama Pacific Exposition. And the Post Office Department, postal officials, decided that as part of their display at this World's Fair, they were going to show every U.S. postage stamp ever issued since 1847. The official archives actually didn't have a lot of these stamps in them because before 1894 the government didn't print postage stamps. It was contracted out to private printers. So they actually didn't have good copies of a lot of the early stamps. And what that meant was, in order to mount this display, the post office was going to have to recreate a lot of early stamps, which they did in 1915. And Joseph Levy, the first curator of the Philatelic Collection, was called into the Bureau of Engraving and Printing as kind of a consultant on this project. Because the government hadn't printed these stamps, they didn't have the recipes for the ink colors. And he was brought in as a consultant to help them match the colors and get the colors of the early stamps just right. And at the end of the project, the BEP said to him, "Well, Mr. Levy, thank you so much. However, can we thank you for all the time you've given us on this project?" And Levy said, "Well, you could give me a complete set of these die proofs for the collection at the Smithsonian," which they did. A complete set of all 413 of the special printings of early U.S. stamps done in 1915 for the World's Fair. And that is today still the only intact set of these 1915 printings. About 3 to 5 sets of each stamp were printed up, but many of them were broken up over the years, the sets, and sold to collectors and all sorts of things like this. But because Levy was the consultant and asked for a complete set, the Smithsonian has the only intact set of these die proofs. You'll see selections from them out in the gallery. This was in 1915. 3 years later, in 1918, one of the greatest events in U.S. philatelic history took place here in Washington, D.C., and that was the discovery of the inverted Jenny airmail error. 24-cent airmail stamp issued in 1918. A single sheet of 100 stamps was sold by the post office to a customer, a patron, with the central image of the Jenny biplane upside down inside the frame. Still today, one of the most famous U.S. stamps and one of the most famous stamp errors in the history of world philately, and it was discovered here in Washington, D.C. This is a photograph of the printing floor at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, showing the type of press called a spider press on which these inverted Jennies were printed. Male operators of the presses who each had a female assistant who put the paper down on the press and then took it up off the press after the impression was made. Running the press, inking the plate was very dirty work. That was considered to be appropriate work for men to do, but the women stayed clean and so that their fingers stayed clean and they only touched the paper as it went down and came on off the presses. So there was a division of labor in the Bureau of Engraving and Printing that way. And then down here in the lower left-hand corner is a picture of the post office, which no longer exists, but was over on New York Avenue by 13th Street. This is you can see in the lower left of the building here, this was the post office where William Roby bought the sheet of inverted Jennies. And Joseph Levy was one of the first philatelists to know about the discovery of the inverted Jenny airmail error. And this was because he was there when William T. Roby brought the sheet into a stamp dealer to try and sell it to him, offer it, and Hamilton Coleman, who was the stamp dealer in question, offered Roby $500, which was far too little for the sheet. But Levy was there and saw the whole transaction and was one of the first to know that these stamps existed. And since he had had such good luck in 1915 asking the Bureau of Engraving and Printing for a complete set of the Pan-Pacific die proofs, he went back to his friends at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing when he found that 8 more sheets of the inverted Jenny had been discovered on the printing floor at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and said, gee, wouldn't you like to send one of those complete sheets of 100 stamps over to the Smithsonian for our collection? This time he was turned down. They weren't interested in publicizing the error or giving a sheet of the stamps to the Smithsonian for the collection. So a full sheet of inverted Jennies in 1918 was an attempted acquisition by the first curator that got away. All was not lost, though, because beginning in the 1960s, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing transferred to the Smithsonian a large collection of certified plate proofs. These are the last proofs that are pulled from a printing plate for stamps before that plate goes into production, actually making stamps. And they're signed and dated with all the authorizations to go ahead and put the plate on the press. And all of the U.S. stamps printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing are reproduced or represented in this collection of certified plate proofs, including the Jenny airmail stamps. Actually 2 plates. Here's the red frame plate, and you can see the plate number there in the upper right-hand corner for the red frame of the inverted Jenny. And here's the plate proof for the blue plane in the center. So they're actually 2 separate proofs. And then through the magic of Photoshop, we now have our full sheet of inverted Jennies. That's roughly what the sheet would have looked like when it was when it was bought at the post office by William Roby. Of course, it would have been all perforated and would have been cut and ready for sale at the post office, but that gives you a sense of what the full sheet of inverted Jennies would have looked like. Okay, the second acquisition that got away was in 1936. By this time, Joseph Levy was no longer curator. Catherine Manning, had succeeded him after he died in 1921. And I'll just very briefly tell you the story of this stamp. It's known as the Penny Magenta of British Guiana. It was issued in 1856, and the story of this particular stamp is that the postmaster in British Guiana had run out of stamps and was waiting for a new shipment to arrive from Great Britain. And when they didn't arrive in time, he went ahead and had some stamps printed up locally to sort of tide them over until the new shipment arrived. He had the stamps printed in 1 penny and 4 penny values. Collectors call these stamps printed locally as call them postmaster provisionals because they were just sort of meant to tide the post office over until the new stamps arrived. Although roughly equal numbers of both values seem to have been printed, both the 1 penny and the 4 penny seem to have been printed in 1856, only one copy of the 1 penny stamp has survived. And it was discovered in 1873, the classic story of the schoolboy going through a stack of letters, found the only known copy of the 1 penny stamp, which he sold for 6 shillings. By 1878, Count Ferrari, famous stamp collector, had purchased it for his collection for £50, a lot of money in 1878. 1922, Arthur Hind of Utica, New York, purchased the stamp for $32,500. This is in the Roaring '20s, and he famously outbid the King of England, who was also interested in owning this stamp for his collection. And the stamp remained in the Hind collection from the time he bought it in 1922 until his death. And when he died, collectors eagerly waited for the sale of his collection, which was handled by the firm of H.R. Harmer in London. And as this catalog started to be mailed out to collectors, you can see this is the catalog for the second sale, which included the West Indies and British Guiana. Everybody was waiting to see what the 1 penny British Guiana would bring in the Hind sale. But when collectors opened their catalog, here's the page that would have had the Penny Magenta on it, and you can see all that's here are 4 penny stamps. The Penny Magenta is not here in the catalog, and collectors wanted to know why. And the reason was very simple. Hind's widow claimed that on her deathbed, her husband had given her the stamp as a personal gift, and it was therefore no longer part of the estate and not to be sold. Hind's widow and the estate were involved in some legal action over this for several years that was ultimately resolved in Mrs. Hind's favor. She was declared by the court to be the owner of the stamp, and so it wasn't included in the sale of the collection. In 1938, Mrs. Hind is asking $50,000 for the stamp, and she's showing it at the New York World's Fair in order to kind of drum up interest in it and get people interested in the stamp. A couple years earlier, though, this is an intriguing little story that I discovered as I was doing some other research. In 1936, before Mrs. Hind was offering the stamp for sale, Catherine Manning tried to put together a pool of collectors to raise the money to buy the stamp for the Smithsonian. These 4 newspaper clippings that you see here on the screen are the only evidence that I've ever seen, but they're from 4 different newspapers. They're all from December of 1936. And in December of 1936, the American Philatelic Congress was meeting in Cleveland, and Catherine Manning was an officer of the Congress, and she was out there for the meeting. And this is where she tried to put together the coalition or the pool of collectors to get their money together and buy the stamp for the Smithsonian. I never quite discovered why this acquisition never happened, except one of these newspaper stories mentions that part of the plan to get publicity and get other people to join in the effort to buy the stamp was to go to the most famous stamp collector in the country, and that was President Roosevelt, and ask him to make the first pledge or first donation of $5,000 towards Mrs. Hind's $50,000 asking price. Asked the president basically to chip in 10% of the price of the stamp. And I'm assuming that what happened is that they got a less than favorable response, and then the whole plan to put the money together and buy the stamp fell apart. So the stamp ultimately is sold in 1940 for $45,000, sold again in 1970 for $280,000, and then the last time it sold was in 1980 when it sold to a collector for just under $1 million. It's quite a fabulous price for what, let's be honest, It's a pretty grubby looking piece of paper. It's a fairly ugly stamp, but the only copy known and extremely rare, and collectors want to own it, and so and that drives the price up. So that's the second stamp that got away. Talk about very quickly about the third collection that got away. And this was the famous Josiah K. Lilly collection. Josiah Lilly was a member of the famous Lilly pharmaceutical family in Indianapolis, Indiana. And he was a prolific collector, not just of stamps, but coins, rare books, artwork, guns, toys, toy soldiers. He had a fabulous collection of leaden toy soldiers, some of which went back to the 17th century. He had all these fabulous collections. And when he died, his will provided that the collections be sold and the money go to various philanthropic causes that he had designated in his will. But the executors of Lilly's estate had a very big problem on their hands, because they suddenly now had to disperse of several major, really very valuable collections. And what that meant was that there was going to be an enormous estate tax bill come due and owing after the sales. And so the executors of the estate approached the U.S. government, the Treasury Department, with the suggestion that the government accept one of the collections for the Smithsonian Institution as payment of the estate taxes that were due. And the Treasury Department said, absolutely not. No way. We want our money. Money talks, right? The executors of the bill
for the relief of the Lilly estate, whereby Congress would direct the Treasury Department to accept this deal and take one of the collections in lieu of the tax bill. And that bill passed the Congress, so now Treasury had no choice but to accept one of the collections as payment of the tax bill. And the question came down to simply which collection was it going to be. And in the end, the finalists were the stamp collection and the coin collection. You can see from the list of sales in the Siegel auction catalog, 10 sales of the Josiah Lilly collection, the variety of material that he had, not just U.S., but general foreign collections, several specialized Great Britain and Commonwealth collections, revenues, Latin American collections. He had a fabulous stamp collection, but in the end, the coin collection was chosen. And that was probably the right decision. I mean, after all, coins, the Lilly coin collection consisted of a large number of solid gold coins, some of which are unique, and I guess gold, and we're all aware now of the price of gold, and gold as a commodity, right, has reached fabulous prices, and so probably taking the collection of gold coins was the best decision. But you know, on that old game show, Let's Make a Deal, you know, when the contestant would choose which window they wanted, before they got to see what they had won, Monty Hall would make them look at everything that they hadn't won. So what did the Smithsonian give up when they chose the coin collection? This is a famous stamp in U.S. history called the Alexandria Blue Boy, another one of these postmaster provisional stamps that was used in Alexandria. It's the only known copy of that stamp on cover. Lilly had the Alexandria Blue Boy on cover, and he also had the 5-cent Alexandria Postmaster Provisional on buff paper, not on cover, just the stamp. He had the block of 4, the unique block of 4 from the lower left-hand corner of the sheet of inverted jennies that has the initials of the workman at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing who actually made the printing plate. He had some very rare 20th century private perforations, vending machine perforations from the turn of the century. And he also had a fabulous collection of Confederate postmaster provisionals from the Confederacy during the Civil War. So those are the 3 attempted acquisitions or possible acquisitions over the years that got away. The full sheet of inverted jennies, the 1-penny British Guiana Magenta, and the Josiah Lilly collection. I don't know if you have any questions about this before we go out into the gallery and see the stuff that we do have. Yeah, Phil.
Yeah, just now you mentioned that you didn't get that collection. Where did they end up, or are they accounted for today?
Oh yes, the pieces are all known. The collection was sold at auction, and lots of different people bought it. Yeah. Yes?
It seems sort of implausible that someone's going to walk into a post office to buy a sheet of 124 cents.
Uh-huh.
Is there any question about how Roby became aware of the sheet and finished the transaction? Any knowledge or any speculation?
Yeah, that's a good question. The question is about William Roby and how he sort of knew that he was going to find a sheet of 100 inverted Jenny stamps over the counter at a local post office. He didn't know it, but he suspected it. This wasn't the first time that this had happened in U.S. stamp history. It had happened very famously at least twice before. It had happened in 1869 and it had happened in 1901. In both of those times, there were stamps of more than one color, bicolor stamps. And anytime you have those in this period, when the printing presses can only print one color at a time, there's always the potential for invert errors. And so Roby knew that when it was first announced that the airmail stamp was going to be a bicolor stamp, he knew that there was the potential for an error sheet or an error to happen. And he actually went to several post offices looking for them. So it wasn't totally by luck. I mean, he kind of knew that they might exist, and he was out sniffing around looking for them. I don't know if that answers your question, or yeah, he was a collector, and he was hunting for them, and he found them.
Did anyone inside tip him off or something?
No. In fact, as soon as the post office discovered that he had found them, all of the post offices. The stamps had actually been distributed to post offices in 3 cities, the 3 cities that were on the route for the first airmail flights: Washington, Philadelphia, and New York. And as soon as it was discovered, or as soon as the postal clerk realized what Roby had purchased, the orders went out to stop sales of all the stamps in all 3 cities. Telegrams were sent up to Philadelphia and New York as well to stop selling the stamps and check the stock. And several post offices actually closed for a few hours that afternoon while they went through their stock to make sure there were no more inverts. And later that night and into the next day, postal inspectors kind of hounded Roby all around the city trying to get the stamps back. Although Roby never actually showed them the stamps to the inspectors, never actually let them have access to them, and that's part of the reason he was looking to sell them very quickly as well. So it touched off in 3 cities, a bit of a frenzy around all these post offices looking to see if there were any more sheets. And as I mentioned during my talk, there were actually 8 more sheets that were found, but they were found at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing before they actually were shipped out to post offices. It was also a bit of a wild goose chase in Washington, D.C., because it was believed at first the details of how the stamp had been printed weren't very well known yet. And it was believed that it had been printed in the traditional way, which was 4 panes on a press sheet, and then the sheet cut down into 4 panes for sale at the post office. And so for a brief period, it was believed by some, including Joseph Levy and William Roby, that since there was 1 sheet, there must be 3 others from the rest of the press sheet. But they soon discovered that that was a mistake. It had only been printed in sheets of 100 on the hand press. So, yes?
The one cent Magenta, the last owner on your list from 1980 was John DuPont.
Right.
And do you know if that is, do you now know where the stamp currently is?
He still owns it, yeah.
Was there some nefarious history of John DuPont? Did he run into some difficulties with the law at some point subsequent to that?
Yes, he's in prison. He's serving a 30-year prison sentence for murder involving the murder of, he was, in addition to a lot of his other enterprises, he was a sports promoter, and this involved a wrestler that he was backing or he was a promoter of, was accused of murdering and is serving a 30-year sentence, but he's still the owner of the stamp. Yeah.